10 most notorious drug lords in cocaine history. Drug trafficking is not a fancy trade. It is way riskier, corrupt, and ungodlier than what is being portrayed in Hollywood movies. However, the proceeds enormity gives drug lords the motivation to defy the odds and the power to run their operations through bribery and serial assassinations. In this episode, we look at the life, accomplishments, vilest acts, and the demise of 10 of the most renowned drug lords in cocaine history. Number 10. Marcola. Marcola, born Marcos Williams Herbas Camacho, is a Brazilian drug lord and head of the Primeiro Comando da Capital, or the PCC, the largest Brazilian crime syndicate today. Marcola was born in April 1968 to a Bolivian father and a Brazilian mother. He started his criminal career as a petty thief on the streets of Sao Paulo at the age of 9. Marcola spent most of his childhood and teenage years in prison, where he learned to read, write, and study philosophy. He had a perfect mastery of criminal organization administration and networking. When PCC leaders fled following a dead bounty placed on their heads, Marcola took control of the organization. He introduced a new, more organized governance system with members paying a monthly levy. He implemented a new code of conduct known as Devil's Code. In 2001, while in detention, he championed 29 prison riots and orchestrated an attack on Brazilian police, which left over 150 people dead. In 2006, Marcola was arrested and convicted of murder, terrorism, and drug trafficking. He was sentenced to 234 years in prison, and yes, it's a prison sentence, not an area code. Number 9. Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela. Rodriguez Orejuela is a former Colombian drug lord and leader of the Cali cartel. Born in January 1939, he started his criminal career with marijuana trafficking. He co-founded the Cali cartel with his brother Miguel in the 1970s. In the 1980s, they diverted operations to cocaine trafficking and immediately monopolized the markets, supplying 80% of US cocaine and 90% of European cocaine. Unlike their rival Medellin cartel that perpetrated violence and invited a lot of attention from the Colombian government, the Cali cartel ran its operations quietly, laundered their drug money through legitimate businesses, and grew steadily. Unfortunately, with the fall of the Medellin cartel in 1993, the Colombian government turned its attention towards the Cali cartel with a campaign of endless police raids. In June 1995, Rodriguez Orejuela was captured and sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 2006, he was extradited to the US and sentenced again to 30 years in prison. Number 8. Christopher Coke. Born in March 1969, Christopher Coke is a Jamaican drug lord and leader of the Shower Posse cartel, founded by his father. With his father's passing in 1992, Coke, then 23, took the mantle of leadership, shipping cocaine and marijuana to the US and using violence to eliminate his competition. They are alleged to be responsible for over 1,000 deaths in both Jamaica and the USA. After making enormous wealth from drugs, Coke resorted to distributing cash to needy residents of his neighborhood. He created employment and set up community centers for the less privileged. At one point, he had gained widespread support to the extent that the Jamaican police had to seek his permission before trespassing in his neighborhood. In 2009, the US government requested Coke to be arrested and extradited to the US. On May 24, 2010, the Jamaican government launched a joint military and police force operation to arrest Coke. This caused violent protests in Kingston that resulted in 76 deaths. Coke finally surrendered himself to the US Embassy for extradition and trial. He said his decision was based on his desire to see an end to drug-related violence in Jamaica, which had already claimed the lives of his father and 2 of his siblings. On June 8, 2012, he was sentenced to 23 years in prison by a US federal court. Number 7. Griselda Blanco. Griselda Blanco was a Colombian drug lady and pioneer of the Miami cocaine underworld. In the early 1970s, she illegally migrated to the US and established her drug business in Queens, New York. In April 1975, she was indicted, but she escaped back to Colombia. She returned a few years later and violently re-established her business by orchestrating the assassination of every possible competition. Her network was generating over $80 million per month, making her the first ever female billionaire criminal. By then, she had ordered over 2,000 murders. This triggered the outbreak of the famous Miami drug war in the 1980s. Blanco was eventually arrested, sentenced to over 10 years in prison, and repatriated to Colombia. Upon her arrival in Colombia, she was shot by a motorcyclist hitman in Medellin on September 3, 2012. Number 6. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. Felix Gallardo is a Mexican drug lord and founding member of the Guadalajara cartel. In the 1980s, the cartel controlled the entire drug trafficking in the US-Mexico border. Gallardo studied business in college and took a job as a police agent. He was posted as a bodyguard for the governor of Sinaloa. Gallardo leveraged the governor's political connections to operate as a broker between corrupt government officials and Mexican drug lords. By the 1980s, with US drug interdiction efforts targeting Colombian traffickers, Colombian cartels began using Felix Gallardo to coordinate their shipments to Florida. Gallardo asked for a whopping 50% cut from the supplies, earning him approximately $5 billion annually. By the end of the 1980s, Gallardo had a complete monopoly over Mexico's drug trade, with top politicians and law enforcement on his payroll. Gallardo was arrested on April 8, 1989, and sentenced to 37 years in prison. Number 5. Joaquin Guzman. Joaquin Guzman, popularly referred to as El Chapo, is a Mexican drug lord and leader of the Sinaloa cartel. Guzman is considered the most powerful drug lord alive. Guzman was born in April 1957 in Sinaloa, Mexico. His father grew marijuana for petty traffickers. At 12, Guzman started helping in his father's marijuana farms. At 16, he decided to open his own marijuana farm. By 28, he was head of logistics of the Guadalajara cartel, reporting directly to Felix Gallardo. When Gallardo got arrested in 1989, Guzman created his own cartel. He started transporting cocaine to the US in chili pepper cans under the brand La Comadre and received millions of dollars in suitcases. In November 2007, Guzman, 50, married an 18-year-old American beauty queen. By 2014, Guzman was importing drugs to the USA more than anyone else. On January 8, 2016, Guzman was arrested at one of his houses on the coastal city of Los Mochis. The house had been under close surveillance after neighbors informed the police that gunmen frequently visit the place. He was extradited to the US on January 17, 2019, and sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. Number 4. Khun Sa. Born in February 1934, Khun Sa joined the Chinese Nationalist Forces at the age of 15, but deserted a year after to create a gang of teenage hoodlums. He gradually grew his followers to hundreds of men. By 29, he had transformed his group into a private militia and fought alongside the Burmese army against the Shan rebels. In return, the government permitted him to use vast land to grow and trade heroin and opium. By the 1960s, he was the most influential militia leader and the country's most notorious opium trader. By 1974, he supplied 45% of the heroin sold in New York and produced over 25% of the world's supply. By 1989, while the US government was indicting him in absentia for drug trafficking, the Burmese and Thai governments were benefiting from his assistance to construct a highway into the region that he controlled. In 1991, he declared the Shan region an independent state and proclaimed himself president. On January 5, 1996, he agreed to surrender his republic back to the Burmese government in exchange for protection and assurance that he would not be extradited to the US. It was also decided that he would retire from the drug business. He died in October 2007 at age 73. Number 3. Jose Figueroa Agosto. Figueroa Agosto was born in June 1964 in San Juan, Puerto Rico. He is considered to be the most dangerous drug lord in the Puerto Rican drug trafficking history. He started his crime career as a drug boat driver, delivering shipments for Colombian and Puerto Rican cartels until 1993, when he was arrested and sentenced to 209 years in prison for multiple charges of murder, illegal possession, and highly sophisticated arms and drug trafficking. Agosto rose to notoriety in 1999 when he escaped from prison by slowly walking past the prison guards after presenting a fake release order. He moved his drug business to the Dominican Republic, where he operated under several alternate identities. 10 years later, he was arrested in the Dominican Republic under one of his false identities for a minor offense. Dominican authorities discovered his real identity just a few hours after his release. By then, he had already crossed the border back to Puerto Rico. In July 2010, Agosto was arrested in a raid conducted by the US DEA, the FBI, US Marshals, and Puerto Rican police. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but released in 2020 after serving only 10 years. Number 2. Roberto Suarez Gomez. Suarez was born in January 1932 in Beni, Bolivia, to a wealthy cattle ranching family. His great-grandfather, Nicolas Suarez, is famous for expanding the rubber trade worldwide. Suarez created a company called La Corporación, which recruited hundreds of Bolivian coca growers and bought a fleet of aircraft to transport his cocaine. Suarez was the biggest cocaine producer in the world in his prime and supplied all major cartels in Colombia, including Escobar's Medellin cartel. He made so much wealth that he single-handedly financed the 1980 Bolivian coup that ousted the regime in power and installed a dictatorial regime that appointed his cousin Minister of Interior. In response to an attack by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, Suarez created his own private air force and an army of 1,500 soldiers specifically trained in Gaddafi's Libya. When his son got arrested in 1983 and extradited to the U.S., Suarez wrote a letter to Reagan offering to settle Bolivia's $3 billion debt in exchange for his son's amnesty. His offer was declined. Also, his nephew and successor, Roca Suarez, was serving a 30-year jail sentence in the U.S. for drug trafficking. Suarez spent the later parts of his life in regret. He depleted his wealth on philanthropic projects like building bridges, rural roads, churches, schools, and hospitals. He was later arrested on July 20, 1988 by the Bolivian police and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was released after 7 years on account of his good behavior. He returned to cattle ranching and died in July 2000. Number 1. Pablo Escobar. When we talk about cocaine and narco-trafficking, the first name that comes to mind is Pablo Escobar. He is undisputedly the most notorious drug lord in cocaine history. Please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Escobar was born in December 1949. He started his criminal career by selling contraband products and kidnapping people for various drug traffickers. In 1976, he founded the Medellin cartel, which established the first cocaine smuggling routes from Colombia to the U.S. and prompted an exponential growth in U.S. demand for cocaine. By 1980, Escobar was smuggling over 15 tons of cocaine per day to the U.S. and quickly rose to become the wealthiest criminal in history. He spent over $1,000 per week on rubber bands used to wrap the stacks of cash received. Approximately 10% of the cash had to be written off to spoilage due to rats and other insects creeping and nibbling on the bills. At the peak of his powers, Escobar controlled over 80% of the global cocaine market. He used aircraft and submarines to transport his loads. He had a specialist squad of hitmen that murdered rival traffickers and adamant law enforcement officials who rejected bribes. It is estimated that Escobar was responsible for at least 600 police officer deaths and an uncountable number of civilian casualties. In 1991, he reached an agreement with Colombian authorities to surrender on the condition that he would not be extradited to the U.S. and that he would serve time in a self-built prison, a deal which authorities graciously approved. The prison, called La Catedral, was also dubbed Hotel Escobar because of its 5-star hotel standard. Besides, Escobar was allowed to pick his own prison guards. However, the government finally realized that keeping Escobar in a guarded 5-star prison, only provided him with a safe haven to properly coordinate his drug business and order mass killings. On July 22, 1992, when government forces attempted to move him to a regular prison, they faced fierce resistance from Escobar's personal guards. They later snuck him through a tunnel leading to one of his safe houses. Following Escobar's escape, the U.S. created a Joint Special Operations Command consisting of SEAL and Delta Force members. They launched a manhunt for Escobar. During that time, rival cartels fueled by vengeance collectively created a vigilante group and launched a bloody campaign against Escobar, killing over 300 of his associates and relatives and destroying most of his cocaine labs and plantations. By then, Escobar was hiding from one slump in Medellin to another. Finally, on December 2, 1993, after 16 months of relentless manhunt, Escobar died in a shootout amid an attempt to elude the task force. Thank you for watching, and do well to check out our next video right here.